Hello, I am Robert L. Patterson, minister for the North Little Rock Church of Christ, located at 1708 Highway 161, North Little Rock, Arkansas. If this is your first time viewing our videos, please click subscribe. The subject for today is widows who are not widows indeed. Widows who are not widows indeed. Widows who are not widows indeed are widows that have any living relatives. So if a widow have any living relatives, she would not be considered from the Bible point of view as a widow indeed. There are gospel preachers that is causing congregations of the churches of Christ to be in error for allowing them to give financial assistance to widows who are not widows indeed. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, Paul taught Timothy, honor widows that are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show pity at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. In the early days, when a person became a widow, if a woman became a widow, if she had any relatives, they would take care of that widow and not put their responsibilities upon the church. And that is the same concept that the churches of Christ should be following today, because that principle is taught in the scriptures. In 1 Timothy 5:16, Paul said, if any man or woman that believe have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So any woman that is a widow and have relatives, their relatives is responsible for taking care of the widows and not the church. And that is not the case in some cases, because some churches of Christ are taking care of widows that are not widows indeed. And Paul is teaching us here a principle that is very, very essential for the churches of Christ to follow in order to be right and pleasing in the sight of God. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 3 and 5, and verse 22, in verse chapter 3, the Bible said, and Elimelech, Naaman's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. When Naomi's husband died, they stayed in that same town for approximately 5 more years because her two sons was alive. So she stayed, and her sons took care of her according to how God had it planned. In verse number 5, the Bible said, and Mahlon and Chilion died. Also, both of them and the woman were left of her two sons and her husband. So now after her two sons died, and they didn't have any children, so now she's left by herself. So Naomi, in verse 22, returned, and Ruth the Moabitite, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned out of the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So when her two sons died, Ruth decided that I must go home now to where my family is. She knew that her family was required by God to take care of her, because now she is a widow and she have to depend upon her family members. This is another example of how God did it in the Old Testament times, showing us how God intended for our family members who, when they become of age and to become widows, and widows who have no other that have children, then they must be protected by their family. In Ruth chapter 2 and verse 1, the Bible said, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, which is her husband, and his name was Boaz. So this woman knew I got relatives that belonged to my husband. So therefore, she had to go back to her family member. When a woman become a widow, indeed, then she is supposed to be taken care of by the church. But a woman that just become a widow and have relatives, it is again the responsibility of those family members to take care of that widow. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 5, Paul said, now she that is a widow indeed and desolate, which means she have no relatives, trusted in God and continued in supplication and prayers night and day. So Paul described in verse 5 what a widow indeed is. A widow indeed, Paul said again, are widows that are desolate, which means they don't have any living relatives, not any at all. So that's very important to remember. I'm sure we read these verses. I'm sure that there are preachers that is teaching about widows in the church, and if not, they should, because this is essential for our salvation. That widow, God gave her qualifications that she must have met in order to be a widow indeed. Paul taught Timothy to teach the churches to take care of their widows that are widows indeed. Widows who are widows indeed are widows that do not have any living relatives. Paul taught Timothy to take care of those women. These women have been faithful to the Lord, they've been faithful to the church, and so now when their husband dies and leaving no offspring and no children, the church is reliable or responsible to taking care of that widow. That widow could be a widow that her husband was a Christian that died, or it could be a gospel preacher who died also and left his wife a widow. But we must look at the concept. Did that person die and his widow was left with family members? If so, then those family members are the ones that should take care of that widow. There are some congregations of the Churches of Christ that are giving financial assistance to the widows of their late preachers, even though they are not widows indeed, simply because of the love that they have for those widows. There are certain congregations that have widows, but most of the congregations that I ever known that had widows that the church took care of, most of those widows were widows of the deceased or the late preacher of that particular congregation. And because of the love that the people have for that minister's wife, they would take care of her financially out of the money that the church had raised for the church. Love is a thing that God intends for all of us to realize and to remember. But when you look at what Jesus taught concerning love in Matthew chapters 10 and verse 37 and verse 38, we need to look at that very carefully, because it doesn't matter how much you love your preacher wife or the lady that's in the church that we call a widow. If that widow have children, it is not the responsibility of that particular congregation to take care of that widow, regardless to how much they love her. In Matthew 10:37, the Bible said, and this is the Lord talking. So Christ said, "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." Those are statements that we need to listen at real carefully, because a lot of people allow a lot of different things to stop them from doing what God wants us to do, and they base it on the love. I tell the church where I preach, the reason why a lot of people do not come to church services is because they do not love God. Love compels us to do the thing that God wants us to do. The Bible said, "And he that loveth his son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." So you see how Christ is dealing with the family members, telling us about how we got to put everything we do away from us in order to please God and to do what God wants us to do. In verse 38, listen to the Bible as I close this lesson out. Listen carefully. In verse 38, the Bible said, "And he that taketh not his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me." When we look at how much we are doing wrong in the churches of Christ, trying to do things that because we love people, that wrongness will cause those congregations to lose their souls in the day of judgment. It would also cause God to look at us in a different light. We need to go back and ask God for forgiveness for a lot of things and make those things right in the sight of God. There are a lot of ministers take the place of deceased ministers, and they come in there under contract and they just do whatever they was hired to do, realizing that there are certain things going on wrong in those congregations, but they refuse to tackle those things and try to get the churches right simply because they work for hire. We must go back and remember that the Lord tells us that whoever we love more than we love him, we are not worthy of him. And I pray to God that all of us realize that we want to be pleasing and acceptable in the sight of God. Thank you for viewing our videos, And will you please help us to spread the gospel of Christ by telling your family and your friends to view our videos and subscribe? Thank you.